Good morning, everyone. Before we get started, I'd like to thank you all for being here and for your interest in joining our discussion today. We're going to discuss a very important shift that's been happening in how organizations manage their supply chains. For a long time, supplier management was much more focused on approval processes, compliance, and supplier registration, with monitoring being much more centered on the documentation side of things. So things like operating licenses, and the documents, right, that these suppliers submit as part of the approval process. But the business landscape has been changing, especially, with today's regulatory environment. Sustainability is moving away from just focusing on the organization's impact on the environment, society, and the economy, and is becoming much more about financial information related to sustainability. And in this context, right, risk management is taking on a central role within this information. Risks are no longer just sustainability topics. They're now influencing financial results, operational continuity, and strategic decision making. The challenge now isn't just identifying these risks, but understanding which ones truly matter to the business, which suppliers have the most financial exposure, and how I can prioritize my resources more efficiently. And that evolution is exactly what we're going to talk about here today. We'll also present a bit about our system, which is SIS, Supplier Management, and how it was developed to support this new way of managing. I'd like to start with the main message of this presentation. Supply chain management has been undergoing this transformation, and it's no longer an activity based solely on controls and compliance. It's becoming driven by exposure, materiality, and financial impact. For a supplier, it's not enough to just know the social and environmental risk they might bring. You need to understand how critical that supplier is to your operation, the financial volume associated with them, and what the impact would be, right, if that risk were to materialize. So this connection here, which we don't usually see within organizations, is what SIS is designed, to bridge. When we talk about social and environmental risks, many people still associate the topic exclusively with ESG reports, but the reality is different. The risks are already identified. Most companies already have a risk management process in place. So they're already identifying, assessing, prioritizing, and monitoring these risks. Companies are already conducting assessments with their suppliers. The big challenge now is to turn all the information we've already mapped out into practical decisions. What we're seeing is this shift, right? So risks are no longer just disclosure indicators and are actually starting to guide the company's operational, financial, and strategic decisions. We're moving away from just a consolidation, an annual or quarterly report. It's no longer about that periodicity. It's becoming a truly continuous management of the supply chain. And this change, it doesn't happen in isolation. It has a whole context, right? A global regulatory movement. So ISSB with the IFRS S1 and S2 standards, as well as European requirements related to, for example, CSRD and CSDDD. And when we talk, about IFRS S1 and S2, we're talking precisely about the need to connect sustainability risks to value creation for the business. So we're starting to talk about financial information related to sustainability. The discussion is no longer about what the risks are and becomes about how these risks affect our ability to generate results. Besides that, the European directive we have on corporate sustainability due diligence, which is known as CSDDD, significantly expands organizations' responsibility over the value chain. The company is now being held accountable not only for its own risks, but also for the risks it has within its supplier chain. This completely changes the relevance we bring to our supply chain. When we analyze, where these risks are concentrated, we find a pattern. So, for example, if I ask you now, for your company, right, where are your largest emissions? You'll definitely tell me it's in scope 3, right? So we have most of the emissions there. From 70, it can reach up to 90%, depending on the sector, of emissions concentrated in scope 3. And just from that, we see, how representative this supplier chain is. If I also ask you, where are the greatest human rights risks, like labor analogous to slavery or child labor, you'll probably tell me that this risk is greater among suppliers. If I also ask if you have any operational dependency, any very critical supplier, again, you'll tell me it's with the suppliers. The company can control what's within its territory, so within the organization. But a large part of the exposure the company has isn't within the organization, but rather in its suppliers, in its supply chain. So we start to see the importance that this supply chain can have within the business. We also have a very important aspect, that these risks don't just stay in the realm of ideas. So when we talk about risks in the value chain, we have to think that they're not just there in the conceptual field, right? They can actually come to materialize financially. So let's imagine here, for example, a supplier who is responsible for a very critical raw material within your company, right? Let's suppose that a climate risk comes to fruition. We have a very clear example here, which, for instance, was the floods in Rio Grande do Sul. So I had a materialized climate risk there, which were the floods. And in my company, I could have a supplier very critical to my operation who provides me with an essential raw material for my business who could be located in that flood region, causing me a supply interruption of that raw material. So we see, right, how this risk can materialize and bring real financial impacts to my company. So I can have a production halt there, a delay in customer delivery, a contractual fine, and a consequent loss of revenue. The risk, it starts there in ESG, but it actually materializes there in the company's finances. So a supply interruption can generate an operational delay, a regulatory problem can generate additional costs, human rights failures can generate reputational impacts and loss of contracts. So the concept of financial materiality, right, it starts to become so relevant. We're no longer discussing the existence of risk, but we're discussing the capacity these risks have to actually impact our business. And this is where we find a very big challenge in organizations, right? Because normally this data already exists. So we already have the risks mapped, the risks monitored. We also have financial indicators. We have a supplier certification in the purchasing department, usually, right? Focused, on this supplier part. We already have these evaluations happening, but this information, it seems to remain isolated. So we have the areas there. So we have the sustainability area, we have the compliance area, we have the purchasing area, but all this information, it's fragmented. It's not integrated, right? We can't have this overview. So when we start a project, right, we might find the following situation, right? The purchasing area, sometimes it has a list of suppliers there that is more critical. The sustainability area has another list of suppliers that is critical for it. The finance area might still have a third view on this, and often these views, they don't coincide. So the question is, which supplier deserves my attention first? If I have several areas, right, telling me that maybe this supplier's critical, another supplier's critical, which is the one that I really have to focus my actions on? When we don't have this integration, right, we have this difficulty, this loss of efficiency in decision making. Organizations end up treating, suppliers the same way, even if they are very different. They end up being treated in the same manner. Resources are distributed without really considering this actual exposure of the supplier. So we have action plans that aren't necessarily directed toward the greatest risks identified in the chain. Teams spend a lot of their time trying to consolidate this information. So gathering this info that's scattered across different areas when they could be actually acting on these risks, right? So that's why the need for a new approach arises. And this is where opportunity lies, right? The opportunity is in connecting and integrating all these elements we've mentioned. When we can link these risks with operational criticality and financial impact, management changes completely. We can define priorities in a much more objective way. We can concentrate our resources where the greatest supplier exposure actually exists. Action plans become much more effective, and we move away from having reactive supplier management. So I stop acting only after the problem has occurred and have a much more preventative approach. I can predict what actions I need to take to prevent this risk from materializing. It's in this context, that SIS supplier management arises. We're not talking here about a tool just for registration or supplier monitoring. We're talking about an entire intelligent data infrastructure to manage your chain. So the goal here is to connect information that is normally scattered within the organization and bring all this info into a single system, bringing much more intelligence to our decision making. The big differentiator of our solution, lies in this integration capability. So we have an architecture entirely focused on integrating this data and having a view of suppliers, risks, and financial impact, a view of the whole. So SIS connects risk information, socio-environmental indicators, operational criticality, and financial impact. We move away from an analysis that was previously isolated and start considering the actual relevance of each supplier to the business. This allows for something very important, which is prioritization. The system can cross-reference multiple risk dimensions with financial and operational information. So on one side, we have supply chain risks, which are regulatory risks, climate risks, human rights risks, and financial impacts. Right, so the spend we have with that supplier, CapEx, OpEx, revenue, cash flow info. Among other operational data, we can cross these two dimensions and identify, right, which suppliers concentrate the most exposure and where the company should prioritize its attention, their action plans, and their governance. Efficient management doesn't just depend on monitoring these suppliers, it depends on knowing where we should really focus our actions. Let's think here, for example, to better understand this concept, about two suppliers. The first supplier has a very high socio-environmental risk, but they only represent 0.5% of my spend. The second supplier already has a moderate risk, but they represent 20% of my spend and are responsible for a much more critical operation within my business. Which of these suppliers do you believe we should deal with first? If I have conventional risk management there, I'll evaluate my risks and define the priorities. If I have a very high socio-environmental risk, at least for the sustainability area, this supplier would definitely be the priority because of the high risk they have in the socio-environmental part. But when I put this information together and I see that despite their socio-environmental risk being high, they represent very little of my spend. And I have another supplier who, even though their risk is a bit lower than mine, represents 20% of the spend and is responsible for a much more critical operation, I can see that the second risk should be dealt with first, right? Because it represents much more, right? If I consider the financial impact, then that risk, which is higher. So it's this type of response that crossing risk and financial impact allows us to generate here, having this overview. So the system transforms, right? Supplier due diligence into continuous, traceable management connected to financial impact. We've made an example, right, to bring here to you. So in this example, in 30 days, starting from a base of 50 suppliers, we were able to identify that 10 of these suppliers accounted for 80% of the chain's financial and operational exposure. What's striking here is that the company believed, right, that this exposure was distributed, but when we consolidated the data, we realized that only 10 suppliers accounted for practically all the relevant exposure. That completely changes our prioritization there. The action plans that would previously have been distributed to dozens of suppliers, we can focus them where this potential impact really exists. Yeah, we can see, right, that the greatest risk isn't always associated with the greatest number of suppliers. Sometimes a very high risk with a very high financial impact can be concentrated in a single supplier or in just a few suppliers. Yeah, often, right? A small portion of these suppliers will account for the greatest exposure. Yeah, when we can identify these critical suppliers quickly, we can act before this risk actually turns into a financial impact. This is the kind of information that changes our decision quality here. Instead of treating all suppliers the same way, we can direct our efforts to where the greatest material risk and the highest potential for business impact actually lie. Besides all that, we've seen a huge gain in governance, right? And with auditable and traceable evidence, which is essential for any reporting, especially when we talk about the regulatory context we're in today. We have a main impact, from SIS on two fronts. So we have an impact on governance, right? We have a gain in traceability and consistency, traceable evidence. This allows us to demonstrate all the criteria that were adopted, justify the decisions that were made, and support the regulatory responses there. This is very important because regulations don't just require a narrative. So it's not enough for me to just tell a story. They really ask for information based on data, processes, control, and evidence. So we see that many companies, used to answer customer questionnaires and audits in a very manual way, right? Each department had to look for information in every different system. And what we see today is a growing demand for traceability. So it's not enough for me to claim I'm monitoring a risk. I really need to show that this supplier was evaluated, what I identified within this supplier, what decision I made based on this available data, and what evidence I can show that supports this decision I made. Besides the gain in governance, we have an operational gain that's very significant. Right. We find that teams spend much less time consolidating this information. They spend less time discussing these very manual processes, performing these very manual processes. And they gain that time to actually act on risks so that they don't materialize. So we increase the operational efficiency of our chain and allow for a better use of the resources we have available. So we see, this change process, right? We move away from supplier management based much more on a documentary form, controls, and it stops being based solely on compliance. We move to a supplier chain management driven by exposure, materiality, and financial impact. The company stops reacting only after a problem has occurred and starts anticipating impacts before they reach operations, cash flow, reputation, and regulatory reporting. We have a much more objective, more structured decision making process, much more aligned with the organization's strategic goals. I'd like to close here then with a reflection, that companies already have this data. So the difficulty isn't in collecting this data. The indicators already exist, the supplier evaluations already exist. The challenge now is to transform all this information that is fragmented within each area of the organization into better decisions, into strategic decisions. So SIS supplier management was developed exactly with this in mind to connect these socio-environmental risks, operational criticality, and financial impact into a single integrated view. We gain not only in governance, but we gain a much more efficient operation, a much smarter prioritization, and a supply chain management effectively driven by data. Because there, what's important in the end is not just monitoring these suppliers, but knowing where I need to act, which risk I need to avoid so that we have effective management of this chain. The problem for organizations, isn't the amount of data they generate, but rather organizing that data, transforming that data into a real decision-making capability. So the supplier chain concentrates a large part of companies' exposure, and the ability to identify, prioritize, and act on this tends to become a strategic competence. So that's exactly what we're looking for here with SIS supplier management, which is to connect and bring this integrated view so that the company's decisions become data driven. I'm available for any questions you may have. Thank you very much.